You take it, Michael.
I'm sorry. No. Hello, friends. Welcome back to the Regeneration Podcast.
Hello, friends.
Michael Martin here. Mike and I were just talking about bees because we both keep bees and we're comparing our years.
We showed our swag, but we don't sell swag. That's why it's totally
Yeah.
fine to do it. Our kids make us stuff with
Well, we
a
will.
Regeneration logo. Yeah.
But yeah. So we were talking about bees because this is the end of the year.
Don't I know it?
And,
Yeah.
and it's really different. It's really for for a farmer like me. It's this time of year is really different because everything kind of slows down and then my attention shifts to other things like like storing firewood, splitting firewood out, which I haven't had much of a chance to do. I still have, but we probably have enough already split to last maybe 4 or 5 months.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I still have, there's a bunch out in the woods that I cut up, but I haven't brought in. I have to do that. But anyway,
The seasonal
so
nature of it all.
it's a different vibe right now, and
Yeah, it's nice,
especially
very pleasant. It's when it's sunny, it's so pleasant. When it's rainy, it's not bad. But today here is sunny fall. The bees again. We also harvested our honey. There's something very bittersweet about that fall activity more than raking the leaves. I find more than the change in temperatures or the first frost. But a certain type of sadness with that. But you were saying, Michael,
no, yeah, just everything changes,
so
and
much.
it's so different, the rhythm right now, which it takes me a minute to get used to, but actually now my attention has changed toward deer hunting
Oh,
because
okay.
you have to start planning for that.
Yeah.
Um, but anyway, yeah, so and Bonnie has been making apple butter and apple sauce and doing
Ditto.
stuff like that.
Amy's making, what was the latest? Oh, we want to make a gardenia. Is that it? Um, it can be used on a sandwich. It's got a wonderful blend of olive and like vinegary stuff, and then all these like celery and things, quite spicy. Oh, a New Orleans sandwich is made from this.
I did not know about it.
Yeah, gardenia or something like that.
Yeah, that's
Anyhow, we want to make it
we're
from,
fermenting a bunch of stuff too. But
yeah,
anyway,
because celery's still in the garden, right? The celery, and it's super tasty. Store-bought
there's a
celery
lot of
versus real
stuff.
celery is the greatest distinction. Yeah.
There's a lot still in the garden because we haven't had a frost yet, which is weird,
Yeah.
for Michigan. But
Neither
anyway,
have we.
we're not here to talk about bees
No.
and farming, though it's nice to talk about those things. We're here to talk about my friend and talk with my friend,
And I get
Karen
to hear how you
Swallow
met.
Pryor. Notorious KSP is in the house, people. And I first met Karen, I had to be 12, 13 years ago through Facebook.
Through
And,
Facebook, of all things.
Wow.
and she wrote an
Did you hit
endorsement.
like on something? Did you give one of these?
I don't know if they had that then. They just
I
probably
think they did. They had this.
They didn't have much in those days. That was before they became an arm of the government.
Absolutely.
but Karen was so kind to write an endorsement for my first volume of poetry, Meditation Times of Wonder, back in the day. And right around that time, tell me if I would get this right, Karen's book Booked came out right around then, right?
Yeah, yes, and that came out in 2012. So
Yeah.
your math is pretty good. Yeah.
And Karen is my kind of person, you know why? Because she's an English professor who actually
Yeah.
likes books. Yeah.
I know the
Imagine.
students don't like books. None of those professors like books. Breaks my heart.
Not
There's
like,
certainly not any secondary high school English departments that like talk about books. I know that. I
well,
didn't really know
like
it. Yeah.
I love teaching
I didn't know
literature.
it went that high. I didn't know it went that high, but I'm
But
not surprised.
Karen, in fact, I was just thinking about this in gearing up for our discussion with Karen, because when I met Karen, she was teaching at Liberty University, and I just fell in love with her with this one post on Facebook where she wrote something, and I'm probably paraphrasing, but it's pretty close. That she said that one of her students came in to talk after class about a poem by John Donne that she was unclear about. And Karen said, "This is why I teach right here."
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
And that's my kind of person right there. So I welcome to the Regeneration Podcast,
Welcome, Karen.
Swallow Pryor.
Thank
So
you.
glad to have you here.
That's a
Thank
great
you for
anecdote.
that beautiful memory. I mean, I don't remember that, but that's actually how I used Facebook when I first got on it, is to kind of expand my classroom and talk about literature and spread the love of literature. So yeah.
And a lot of and we both know a lot of English professors do not do that.
No, yeah, no. But
Because
I had a lot of them.
yeah, but I do. I'm the type that gets all excited when I talk about stuff in literary topics.
I think I was rather blessed then. And again, I'm a critic of all education, not just higher ed. I must have lucked out. I didn't, all I can say is I know I didn't take advantage of probably what they were offering me, but even if I was mature enough to do it, I still think I probably would have lucked out in most English professors and even secondary, high school English teachers, because they're out there. That's the point. But you're saying they're in much shorter supply than I would know.
Well, it's not that they're in short
not
supply.
surprised.
It's just the ones that really love literature are in short supply. There's plenty of English professors.
And couldn't that be that they've resisted the ones who love literature? I want to think that a lot of them got into it for the love of literature, but the ones like our guest, they had the courage to not go with the flow. Do you think that's most? Yeah. So I think it's an issue of courage.
And Karen, tell me, I think you received your doctorate in English from SUNY New York, right?
Yeah, State University of New York at Buffalo, and they're big. They're very big on theory there. And so Michael, I guess Michael 1 and 2.
You can use Mike for me and Michael for him.
Okay, Mike, like you just touched on, like that is my whole story of like it took a lot of courage to just kind of get through intact and loving my literature. So we won't get into that, but yeah, it was very hard. It was hard.
I should write to my former professors then and say thank you for your courage.
Well, seriously, right? Not only as a person who loves literature, but as a Christian who loves literature, and let's compound it even more for poor Karen, as an evangelical Christian who loves literature. Awesome. She was a triple threat player in university.
It's really true. It's true.
Yeah. The swords were out for you,
and that's what Karen's book Booked is about. It's a love letter to literature, and I love it. And then was it right after that you wrote?
You were Xena Hits before Xena Hits was Xena Hits.
Convictions about Hannah More.
Right. Yeah, and that was drawing on my PhD dissertation, which I did manage to write in that program and get out. That book was a sort of a trade version of my dissertation.
And here's another thing. So now sometimes, not all the time. So this semester I was teaching humanities, and one of the units of the humanities curriculum is to do stuff on the Enlightenment, Romanticism, and kind of the transatlantic slave trade crosses over there. And there's this film, I don't know if you've seen it, Mike, but I think it's one of the great films of the early 21st century, is Amazing Grace, which I'm sure Karen knows. And
I was thinking of Amistad.
It's about William Wilberforce.
Yeah.
And it's really beautifully made. But Hannah More is in the film, and I always, every time I see it, I think, I wonder what Karen thinks of this performance.
No, it's actually good. And I when I was doing my dissertation, I finished it in 1999, which is an ancient history, but no one had heard of Hannah More. I mean, they had when she would, there was at her time, but she had been forgotten. And when that film came out, she was just being rediscovered. And now there's a whole new generation of younger scholars that are studying her and appreciating her in a more nuanced way. So it's very exciting to see her get her due.
Yeah.
Right. And it's so exciting to see you at once again, Karen was at the vanguard of this whole thing. Now, we're here today to talk about Karen's newest book, and mostly, I mean, we can talk about other stuff too, because Mike and I have ADHD and we don't stay on task.
I want to talk about your article on Walt Whitman at some point, but we'll save it.
But here we go. The evangelical imagination. And I love the subtitle. It's so intriguing. How stories, images, and metaphors created a culture in crisis. So Karen, I mean, it's a great book. I mean, I'm enjoying reading it this week. And I couldn't, Karen comes from the evangelical world, and Mike and I come from the Catholic world, and I come from probably bizarro world in as far as Catholic world goes. But what struck me reading this and knowing you as I do, and knowing your history, I mean, I've had a few rough years. And so has Karen. I mean, Karen, how long did you get hit by? Karen was literally hit by a bus.
Wow, Karen.
That was how many years? 7 years ago?
5 years ago,
5 years
2018.
ago.
It's a
And
feather in your cap, even if it was a
totally
cast
recovered.
on your back. Yeah.
And then she left Liberty, right?
hmm
And you went to the Southern Baptist University. No, which you left, right?
Southeastern Theological,
Southeastern.
yes, at which I just left. Yeah,
You
Where was
just
that
left.
located? What city?
in Wake Forest, North Carolina.
Huh.
And so is this the only time probably in the last 20 years or so that you have not had a full-time teaching gig?
Yeah, the last time in the last 25 years. Yeah,
Wow. How's that
yeah.
feel? Because you're like the teacher's teacher.
Yeah, it wasn't my plan, and it's been hard, but I had to exercise courage and do what was right.
And
And
that's one of the
yeah.
things I love about Karen is um you can I mean, she's very honest and open and shares, whether it's on social media or other places,
Courageous.
her deep faith and her, I mean, we all kind of struggle to trust God when we go through those weird things that happen, those horrible, life-changing events like getting hit by a bus. Or in my case, when my college closed, and then a couple of years later my wife ended up with uterine cancer. Those moments, they test our faith, but they're also opportunities to see what faith really is.
Yeah, exactly.
And I understand that now. And so what, short story long, so like you, I mean, I have the last 7 years or so have been a period of internal spiritual adjustment, shall we say, for me. And when I read your book, when I read your book and read it, I get that same sense, but from an evangelical perspective that I have been undergoing myself. Kind
This
of
will be
there's a soul
fascinating.
searching, and there's it's kind of like stepping off into the void in a sense. And I don't mean to sound ominous or anything, but I think there's something profound here, and I think that's what you mean by created a culture in crisis. So can you talk about what you mean by how stories, images, and metaphors created a culture in crisis?
Yeah, there's a funny story about that subtitle, because the title of the book was the one I always had in mind. It was kind of a no-brainer. But in developing the subtitle, you do that, close to the time the manuscript is being turned in, and there are a lot of editors and marketers involved in it. And I know my acquisitions editor suggested the word crisis earlier on, and I said, no, I don't want that word in there. It's too, it sounds too dramatic and clickbaity. But then by the time, I mean, it clearly is about stories, images, and metaphors, so that part was a given. But by the time I was ready to turn it in and finish it up, I was like, okay, let's go with crisis. Because as you said, Michael, I mean, the past few years for many of us, for sometimes different reasons, but I think overall, maybe the same, it does feel like a great shift under our feet, a sifting thing. The old categories don't hold, the ground is moving. And as I say in the book, I mean, it could, I think it's a 500-year moment, but maybe it's like a 1,000-year moment, not to be overly dramatic.
I've always thought it's a 1,000-year moment, and have written about it many, many times. Like, because
let's talk about that.
It would just be the church, according to Chesterton, has died and resurrected 5 times. And it's not that it gets sick and it gets better, but it's died. First at Pentecost, then the Arian crisis, the Albigensian, and something about. So we have those kind of cycles, and we have like Oswald Spengler and so forth. But I think we're just coming out of something that's, well, let's say 1,000. Yeah, that's something maybe post Charlemagne. That I'd say it took the gospel and put it into the musical register of a thing called a religion. This thing where you do these things to get to place A called heaven and a place B called hell. And we focused on the overworld. And I think we're moving back into a musical register coming from the gospel of language having to do with healing and so forth, themes of friendship, themes of courage. And from the Latin, the edge of Latin is top down, very top down. I've heard it said, I'm sure you're a linguist more than I am, but the same phrase said in Greek feels liberating and from the bottom up. And this can coincide too with the age of, honestly, say from the age of Pisces to the age of Aquarius, but let's say 1,000-year cycle, some of that, or maybe again, the domination of the self-image is that of a book to the self-image. It's finally just settling into us. We are seeing ourselves as computers now, working around people who are dying. They say themselves as shutting down. That was a big thing for Ivan Illich as well. Some of those epistemic things are huge for me.
Well,
a
no,
little more than you asked for. Yeah.
No. I want to read your stuff. I mean, I'll be completely honest. The process of writing this book and the shifting that I'm going through has led me to more thinkers that are adjacent to your circles. And, I'm very unversed in them, but I am going in that direction.
Give
slowly.
us an example.
Well, I think did I ask you, Michael? I asked you for your recommendation of Paul Kingsnorth.
Yes.
Right. And so I got Savage Gods, and I've been reading that, and it's
okay.
It's amazing. I feel seen and heard, and then I'm also I'm doing some reading on participation
Right.
and
Owen Barfield type stuff, or
Owen Barfield, and then a little more
we know where you're headed. Probably we remember when Spencer Clavin was saying the same thing, that all of a sudden he had to crack a book by Rudolf Steiner and we all feel guilty or something like that.
I mean this all, again, even though it's new to me, it's giving me language and understanding, and the idea of a 1,000-year moment. Like, I was just writing some notes because this really makes sense to me. And if we went from book to computer, though, I wanted to ask you, Mike, so what's the next metaphor?
Well, I mean, so it's, we came from, you could say this, I think it's, if we keep it to Owen Barfield, the caveman's consciousness was fully participatory, right? Mm-hmm. And then we kind of get liberated from that. We have the growth of the I, especially at the incarnation. And now the danger of systems, right, is that Ivan Illich would say that we went from being one with everything. So we had a tool. In the Middle Ages, the word for tool meant the hammer, the hand, and the hammering hand. It was no separation. Mm-hmm. Then we went to the instrumental reason and so forth. But right now, in the age of the computers, is it a regression to the original participation where, it's the same thing as, are we moving towards a community or a regression to a crowd formation? But some of these things are really, really epistemic too. So I would say the computer is the image we're using, but are we going to have a new oneness with technology, but also keep our separation? Or are we going to be grafted into it, which is some of this AI scare, by letting our right brain atrophy completely and we're all left brain weirdos, and then it's the apocalypse.
That's the threshold moment, though, right?
It's the threshold moment.
Which way is it going to go?
Yeah.
But it's really
heavy.
Just to riff on that a little tiny bit. I mean, in fact, I wrote about it today in my Substack. Is the idea of the Celtic idea of the other world, right? Where and I see some students, some young people getting into this, not everybody, but we see it in Paul Kingsnorth, see it in Martin Shaw, right? Where they're they have one foot in the tradition and one foot invoking a kind of Christianity of the wild, right? Mm-hmm. Which when Spencer and I were in DC back, when was that? In July. The way I articulated it was, I asked, and Paul Vanderklay, speaking of evangelical Christians, Paul was there, and one of the main question I had burning on my heart at that moment when I gave that talk was, is a phenomenological disclosure of Christianity possible? Right?
Great way of
phrasing it. I think that might be, the threshold we're at, and it could go into that direction, or it could go into complete technocratic capture. It could go either way, right?
Michael, can I share one? Just our friend Lindsay Rose had a tweet that I thought on this issue was just spellbinding. And you use the other world, I tend to use the underworld, but she said, I think it was yesterday, and I wrote her and thanked her for it. It's a tweet that said, I think Stephen Clark, a guest we had on who's very conversant with the Native American traditions. I think Stephen Clark is right. We have spent millennia trying to escape through transcendence, but we failed to the edict to follow instead of worship, right? We're supposed to follow. That's what I'm saying with religion. We spent 1,000 years just the worship. And she said, we're entering the underworld generations. Hark to Persephone. Even Dante learned that the way out is through. Some of this stuff, through and not out. And I could send even a quote from Coventry Patmore, who said kind of the same thing. The pagan who simply believed in the myth of Jupiter, Alcema, and Hercules, much more than he who had been initiated into the unspeakable names of Bacchus and Persephone, knew more of living Christian doctrine than any Christian who refuses to call Mary the mother of God. And we'll just say the divine feminine at this point. But understanding this underworld stuff of Persephone is super important now. The role of the feminine.
Coventry Patmore, like my Coventry Patmore.
Yeah, he's wild.
Yeah. Wow.
Oh no, his later career. Gerard Manley Hopkins told him he could never publish a book on his Eros poems and so forth, and it's lost to posterity like Beethoven's incomplete symphonies. He burned the book that we would all love to read. Coventry Patmore, Gerard Manley Hopkins told Patmore in his later stages, you've revealed too much. It makes the Song of Songs look like child's play. But Evangelical Press has, the Rod, the Root, and the Flower, which is a great introduction to how rich and totally deep Coventry Patmore can be. Oh yeah, Angel of the House, that's so funny. He's hidden behind doilies and things, this wild furnace of craziness. Yeah.
Wow. You guys are going to have to send me a reading list. I should have asked you ahead of time, but
Yeah.
But yeah, that's the crisis, right? That's the one I was talking about, but you got
heavy.
Now, interesting. So, so my doctorate is in early modern English literature. So basically I tell people when they say, well, what did you get your doctorate in? It's basically Protestant mysticism. That's what I did. So I always tell people I'm like 90, I'm like 48% 17th century Anglican. And I want Robert Herrick to be my pastor. But I know that the territory very well, especially in the 16th century, where, and you write about this in the book, that's why I want to bring it up, the anxiety about images, which you see in Edmund Spenser, you see it in Milton, right? And you talk about the Protestant or evangelical anxiety about images and how things shifted from the image to, like in Catholic culture, to the word, right? And especially to preaching. But the thing, and here's the thing: we're English professors. We know how important the image in the word is. And is that something you're contending with in not just personally, but in the book as well?
Yeah, I'd have to say personally, I have contended with this a lot because not only am I Protestant, but like I've been Baptist almost my entire life. And so I have struggled to overcome sort of my privileging of, the word and words, but my love of images. And so I think this is part of my sort of personal crisis and the one I am addressing in the book, because it's not either or, it's both and, right? But my tradition does not deal with that very well. And so I'm not claiming that I have dealt with it well, but I think I am in the book trying to raise the tension and address it to at least begin to better understand it, because I think this contributes to the crisis as well. It's really axiomatic now in evangelicalism to recognize that so many younger and not necessarily younger evangelicals are kind of leaving the traditional evangelical church for more liturgical experiences. Even Catholic churches, I've seen a lot of my Baptist evangelical students convert to Catholicism. So there's obviously something missing. There's obviously some imbalance that we're not bringing into proper tension, and that's an ongoing matter. And I think it's part of this crisis.
But I, on the other hand, I see the same same problems. Well, I see a lot of young people attracted to those liturgical traditions, whether it's Roman Catholicism or Orthodoxy, right? I mean, I think it's what happened to Paula Kingsnorth, and even people who aren't evangelical who
We
grew up
always
in
see
an
that as a
atheist
problem.
background, right? Well, they're attracted to
We're
it
the only people in
because,
the world who think, oh, you went too far, bro. I don't know.
well, no, but I think they want a sensual experience of the
Right.
Yeah,
spiritual,
yeah, I
right?
get it. I get it.
And they and it's weird. I mean, if you look at the history of the church, I mean, part of in the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, was rejecting the sensuality, considering it a kind of a trap or a lure, right? Or a deception. But then, fast forward 500 years now, how many Protestant churches don't have a praise band and a stage, right? And the criticism during the Reformation was that the Catholic Mass was nothing but theater, right? It's kind of funny. But I think what's important, and I think what I love about your book, Karen, is that you're not afraid to go there. You're not afraid to go there. And just like Mike and I in the Regeneration podcast are not afraid to go there in regards to the tradition in which we were raised, right? In which our faith was formed, and that's it, which
I've never
makes
heard it
for a
described that
peculiar,
way.
it makes
Makes
for,
me
like
nervous all of a sudden.
well,
Yeah.
it makes for
I was just doing it. Now that it has a name, it makes me creeped out. Yeah.
well, it makes for a peculiar moment, right? It's a weird place we're in.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't know what to think about it. I mean, and of course, the elephant in the room we haven't mentioned is that, I mean, culturally, at least in this country, all across the West, Christianity is in decline.
Right. At least superficially it is, right? I mean,
right.
Right.
This is one of these
Institutional
mysteries.
Right. And all the headlines and all the polls and surveys are about that, but maybe from the margins, the remnant will emerge, not to sound so, like apocalyptic, but those are words I've always heard other people say
But also
about the remnant.
Let's go back to Barfield for a second. Couldn't the final participation be, as it brings together the one and the many, like the Trinity, total individuality, total union. It brings together the male and the female, brings together these seeming opposites, weaves in contradictions. That's something I loved about your article, Karen, on Walt Whitman. That the American charism that we can bring when this iteration of the church dies is a real appreciation for the one and the many. That's going to be our thing. I think Our Lady of Guadalupe is somehow behind that too, but that's a song this land is singing. So I'm always saying we need a marriage of the kind of that Western Catholic tradition with the earthborn tradition of Whitman, for me, Cervantes, Rabelais, Shakespeare. But and your article get into that. But even I guess this is my point: the Christian, the atheist, and the believer, right? This is what Dostoevsky was pointing to, that this is it's really becoming a little more murky than people think, right? I believe in transubstantiation. That's an interesting comment nowadays. What does that mean? What does that mean? And so what was the point of Henri de Lubac's book, the drama of atheist humanism about? What is some of the dark draw to Dostoevsky? And I repeat this anecdote again, that in his lifetime, the great scholar, that patristic scholar, Theophane the Recluse, the most well-read mind in patristics at his lifetime, was reading Dostoevsky and said he sees more than any church father has seen, right? These are some of the things arising in our time, And
it's just so interesting and surreal as someone who came from, a fundamentalist adjacent evangelical background, studying all of these things, learning these things about like post-modernity. For 20 years, I taught my students about what post-modernity was, and initially kind of in that alarmist way that I was taught, but eventually much less so, and more in a more nuanced way. But this is really what we are talking about, like the categories breaking down, the end of the reign of reason and rationalism alone, something more synthesized, something more, I don't know, I mean, you put it in better words than I can, but it's surreal, and it's hard and disorienting, but it's also exciting and good, I think.
Absolutely. So, yeah, I mean, I think I mean, it's exciting. So for instance, where we live, we live in rural Michigan, and it's weird because being a professor living in a rural Michigan, those worlds could not be more different. And the people I mostly interact with here are either other farmers or the Amish. I'm going to use the Amish. We go to an Amish grocery store, and we use Amish. We buy feed for our animals from the Amish, and I mean, you can't get any more evangelical than the Amish. They're hardcore, right? They think Baptists are modernists, right?
Well,
But I get along with these guys so well, and because I mean, you get this sense, and I think this is one of the currents that's running through our culture right now, is it's almost like a back to the land movement, but it's also back to reality. I mean a Christian reality movement, which is so encouraging to me, because I joke. I mean, these comic guys, they're so funny. They're always joking around with me about this or that, and all they want to talk about is deer hunting. And but there's, I mean, and I like this. I mean, I like this, and you see this, but it's so easy for it to become derailed into something ideological, right? And but there is hope, like you said, Karen, that we can find something authentic at the kernel of it. And I think you mentioned postmodernism, and I think of the later writings of Jacques Derrida, when he became basically a negative theologian, right? Which is, to me, it was kind of a liberating way to start thinking about religion. And he talks about, what if we talked about a religion without religion, right? And I think he was onto something. And I think that's probably what inspired my idea about a phenomenological disclosure of Christianity. Because what we've had until now, the disclosure of Christianity is usually in the hands of the gatekeepers, right? The authorities of the church, right? Whether it's the Catholic Church or the Evangelical, right? Or the pastor or whatever. Or in the Orthodox tradition, they're always pointing to the fathers, right? To the tradition, to the fathers. But I think we have here a moment, and tell me if you think I'm crazy or not. It seems like a make or break moment, where you remember Barfield's book, Romanticism Comes of Age. I mean, we could write another, Christianity Comes of Age, because I think we're at that threshold where that could be possible.
It's like the second naivete of Paul Ricoeur, the second childhood, right? Again, it's this recursion at a higher level, a return with a difference. These are all the themes. And the energy of the theme seems to be more akin to not like balancing something. That's what everybody thinks. It's, again, that's why Ian McGilchrist's book on the brain hemispheres is so important. That, and this is the Ivan Illich too, when the right brain loses its primacy to send out the left brain for tools. And Karen, this is your work, as far as I understand it. You have your courage because you're willing to flip the thing, because we need to reverse the notion of what's primary, which is the right brain, which is practical reason. Theoretical reason goes out after that. The feminine is primary, sends the masculine. And so this is kind of an epochal change. And I took some time there because I see your work doing this. You just smelled your way into this whole thing. And again, I go back to the courage, because you were discovering things. But I think it's akin to turning things inside out. But everybody talks about it. Oh, we need to make the mission of the church equal with the financial administrative. No. One is there to serve as the tool of the mission, right? These types of things. Yeah.
No, this is, I mean, you're just giving me language for what I'm have been seeing and understanding instinctively. And again, in my evangelical world, especially out on the Twitters and in the media, you'll see all this hand wringing over the young people leaving the church and the unchurched and the nuns. And I see them saying, like, there was a dust up the other day about this, that they are not abandoning Jesus. They are finding Jesus because they've left the church. And I love the church, and I've always been an institutionalist, but not these institutions.
Yeah.
And not this church, right? I mean, so yeah, something is happening, and it sounds very much like what you're talking about.
Right. And I know, I mean, that's not talking out of school because you posted about all this, but you've been burned by the church, right?
Right.
And so have I. And that's, and I get into this with people, whether, and once in a while, for me, it's all just coming to terms. They use that term, the church. And I say, okay, what is your definition of the church? And often as not, nobody can come up with a definition that holds any water. It's a generality, right?
And the church that they and most people are talking and thinking about today is a church of the past 500 years, not of eternity, right? Not of the future.
And it's weird. What's the weird thing, right? I mean, even, and it's almost inescapable because, it's in here someplace. I don't know where it is. I have a copy of the 1564 Geneva Bible, and of course they have on the frontispiece the church not made by hands, right? The invisible church. But it's not so invisible anymore. I can see where it is. It's right there. Yeah. But that was, I mean, I think that was one of the great contributions of the Reformation, but it evaporated quickly. It went away. I mean, I think that was a beautiful intuition, because I think that's absolutely correct. But, in fact, here's an interesting story. So my daughter attends a Evangelical Methodist university not too far from here. And one of her friends, young woman, who was adopted, I think, from China. And the girl, when she came, and she had, at the school, so my daughter's there, so she is kind of Catholic. And there are other Catholic kids at this school. And her friend went to church with one of her Catholic friends one Sunday. So I'll go. I always want to see what a Catholic church was like. So she went in there. And she comes home and she tells her parents, but her father's a Baptist preacher. And she's basically been excommunicated from her family for even stepping inside of a Catholic church. And the poor kid, I mean, she's 18. And the problem is, I mean, that's the problem when you have the church. You have an idea of what the church is, then everybody, I mean, put it this way: if you subscribe to that concept, the church, then everybody is a heretic. Somebody.
Well, this explains my life for the past 7 years. So, right? That's exactly what
It's like a bus hitter.
Happening. Yeah, it's like a bus hit me. Yeah. And then the Theo Bros. So the Theo Bros first, then the bus.
What else are you reading, Karen? Or it's not to say get personal, but do in one sense, not saying tell secrets, but bring it for listeners. You're super intelligent. What I hear again, you've been pushing things and discovering them on the way. You're as Rilke would say, a honeybee of the infinite in some way, and you're out there. Describe your journey a little bit. As it feels like, do you get nervous that you're losing friendships? And again, we're asking from people who aren't secretly thinking you're going to end up in Rome or something. None of that. No, no, right, no. So so yeah, where are you? Because yours will be an interesting journey to hear about and to follow.
Yeah. So over the past, I'd say in the process of obviously writing this book, there was a lot that I had to read in history and American culture that I wasn't up to didn't ever know. I learned a lot in the process of writing this book. But again, because I something early in the conversation reminded me, I wanted to say, because of the way I end the book about just following Jesus as the way.
Not a bad
That's
plan.
I mean, so revolutionary, right? So novel and original. But so that's I'm picking up my reading there, and so that is why I'm actually rereading Owen Barfield, Saving the Appearances, specifically some of his other stuff on language. King's North, as I mentioned. Michael Gorman is the sort of Baptist Orthodox Baptist or evangelical Protestant writer on participation theology.
Wow.
Hans Boersma. So
And you said Michael Gordman?
Gorman, Gorman. He gives sort of an acceptable to evangelicals take on participation. So as far as I know, anyway,
we should abbreviate that. ATE, acceptable to evangelicals. Boom. Stamp. Bam.
On my fun reading, I read because when I've been traveling a lot, so I try to just take books I want to read for fun. I've read one of Nabokov's early novels. I can't even remember the Mary, I think it's called, that he translated himself, and some new to me short stories by Franz Kafka. I love Kafka, and I still haven't read all of his work. So yeah, that's what I've been reading.
That's very cool.
So let me ask you this, because one English professor to another. And I mean, your love for literary works is palpable in everything I've read by you, and your love of Christ is also palpable. Now, where do the two meet for you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. I talk about this some in Booked, because again, in the environment where I grew up, which was very rural Maine, country Baptist, and thank goodness, really, as sort of country and rural as I was, it was at least before the sort of, I mean, I'm old enough and was separated enough so I didn't grow up in that evangelical subculture, even though it was a pretty conservative environment. And so I did not even, so I don't come from an academic family. I had no vision set before me about an academic life or a literary life or the life of the mind, other than that my parents just let me read whatever I wanted to read and encouraged me to be who I wanted to be and do what I wanted to do. Imagine that.
Wow, yeah, innovative.
You
got to read Rudolf Steiner to get that. That's not fair.
Yeah.
It's only there in Rudolf Steiner.
But I never imagined to be, being an English professor or anything like that. I just majored in English in college and then didn't know what I wanted to do. So applied to a PhD program serendipitously and got in. And that's where I discovered, there are people who study and teach English who don't really like literature. Okay, that's weird. So, wow, it was quite a shock, because I did have wonderful teachers, and my schooling before that, as Mike had, and it really wasn't until, and so by then though, I was really being formed by the evangelical subculture. So really, had a pastor in church that was more involved in the culture wars. I mean, they were good, and I love those people still to this day, but that was the ethos of the age. And I was the only Christian in the program, and didn't really know, and it was very hostile to Christians, and it was just in that context where I realized, well, actually, I'll tell you, because you'll find this interesting very briefly. I was taking a class on writing reviews, criticism, for popular culture, films and television and books of the month or whatever. And I came to class one day, and the students were very upset with the professor and they said that there was no way they could complete the assignment because he was asking us to make a judgment on the work. And there was no way we could possibly say whether a work of literature was good or bad. And the light bulb went on I was like, wait a minute. I'm like, of course we can. But I did not know how to answer. I didn't know how to answer them. And so I left the class on a quest to find whoever I could, read whatever I could, to address, to say how and why we can say judge literature and art, and aesthetics. And that's when it all came together for me. And I eventually developed a course around that, Christian poetics. And
Right.
so it wasn't until near the end of my PhD program when I figured out how to integrate my love of literature and my love of Christ and the church, and to serve them all together.
Now, here, my memory has just been jogged. Now, I recall a long time ago a post of you on Facebook. You, in the poetics course,
Facebook. I love referencing
did
Facebook.
you not
It's so great.
use Jacques Maritain, right?
Yeah, I use him most of the time in the course.
Yeah, because he's awesome, because
Yeah.
he goes right exactly where
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
In fact, he says in one place, when you send
I'm writing notes in a book by Jacques Maritain called Science and Wisdom, which is this whole kind of science and wisdom by Maritain.
but what he says is, when you make of your sin, you make your sin beautiful, you send it like an angel amongst your brothers, and it kills them without a sound, right? Which I think is, if you're going to talk about whether there's good or bad literature, that's 0.0, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, he's a son. Of course, I have to use a lot of Catholics in teaching this course. So, because the Catholics have the best aesthetic theory, and that's something we actually talk about. I always say, why do Baptists and Protestants generally not address this well, or why do Catholics have all the good art? And so this goes back to what I said before about my own wrestling with word and image, because my tradition, as committed as I am and have been to it, for a number of reasons, I'm seeing that some of the questions that I have that it can't answer maybe are things that I need to answer.
Well, it's the question of iconoclasm, right?
Right.
Which you talk about quite a bit in the evangelical imagination. I mean, you talk about quite a bit, and I think but it's not just the evangelical tradition. It's actually haunts Catholicism and Orthodoxy as well. It goes back to the early years of the church, where, when are graven images okay? Which, of course, people will say sola scriptura, turn to the Bible. So God says in Exodus, right, thou shalt have no more graven images. And a couple of chapters later, he gives instructions how to build the ark filled with graven images. Right? Okay, God, can I talk to you for a second? Explain it.
You're messing with my mind, God.
Yeah, that's right. What do you mean put figures? Two cherubim, aren't those graven images? Not really, not technically.
And they seem to be doing, the rumor is they were involved in a dirty act. That's in the Kabbalah.
So to answer my question though, where does the literary and the spiritual intersect in your own world of faith, your own, not the world of faith, in your own being of faith? Does it? I know it does for me. That's what I'm asking.
Absolutely. No, I mean the metaphor I constantly return to, it's a almost cliche, or it feels cliche to me, is Emily Dickinson's "Tell the truth but tell it slant," right? You should, I need to memorize the whole poem, but because you can't paraphrase it, but I will anyway. But her whole point is, there's something about what it means to be human that we can't take the entire truth face on. We can't look into the light, right? But there's something, I mean, this is even Aristotle talks about, like, we just delight in imitation. It's a pleasure. And so there's something about seeing something slant, something, feeling this is even pedagogical, right? Like, we learn something better when we think we have discovered it, right? And so anything that helps us feel that sense of discovery, even if it's just pointed out to us, which is, by a good teacher, by a work of art, by a poem, by a novel, we learn it better. And that's why, again, in books, there's a line. It was my working title for a while. I talk about how I just even growing up as a Christian in a Christian home, my relationship to God was more intellectual and rational and not emotional. Not because I'm not an emotional person. I've actually since discovered that I'm highly sensitive, which explains a lot about my life.
I had a feeling I was highly sensitive.
Well, it's like a highly sensitive person. It's a form of neurodivergence, but it's and so not so it's like a capital H and S, not like, oh, I'm super sensitive. But it's like, so I liken it what literature does for me as to when God told put Moses in the cleft of the rock, just that he could see the back of God. So literature like allows me to see the back of God, because to look at him, to see him fully is just too much. I mean, so that's what I feel like literature in particular does for me, just because I'm wired for words, but all art does it.
Yeah, then felt I like some watcher of the skies when a new planet swims into his ken, or like stout Cortez when with eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific, and all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise, silent upon a peak in Darien, which is from Keats's on First Looking into Chapman's Homer, right? Which is about, I'm not the first guy who saw this, but I just saw it for the first time, and it's so exciting, right?
Yeah.
And that being, I don't know if you do this, but I can't help it sometimes. So, where you cry in front of the students. Have you done that?
I have, like, once, I think.
I do it too often. So, for instance, I did it a couple weeks ago. I was teaching Twelfth Night by Shakespeare, and we got to the recognition scene where Viola finds her brother Sebastian, and they're dressed like each other, and there's this whole question and answer, a cold catechism, really. And every time I teach it, I'm like, okay, I'm wrecked. And the students are like, wow, you really lost it there. I shut up. But for me, there are these moments, and I Simone Weil writes about one with her engagement with George Herbert's poem Love 3.
Right.
Where she translated into French, and every time she felt a migraine coming on, she repeated to herself just as a way to keep off the migraine. But she said in a letter to Father Perrin, but eventually it took on the virtue of a prayer. And it was during one of these recitations that Christ himself came down and took possession of her, which is why my dissertation was not entirely, but it was inhabited by quite a few metaphysical poets because of that. Because there's something in, especially religious poetry, that doesn't always, that not only do we, you read Jane Austen, you feel like Jane Austen. You read enough Jane Austen, and people don't say I'm reading Pride and Prejudice. I'm reading Jane Austen, right? Because you feel like you know her,
right?
But then sometimes, so I felt like I know George Herbert or John Donne or Thomas Traherne. But what happens with those poets for me is once in a while, the subject of their poem shines through the poem and illuminates my own soul. I mean, which is a pretty extraordinary experience. And I see that with the best poets. Even Mike mentioned Dostoevsky earlier, right? Same thing with Dostoevsky. The other part that always wrecks me is in Crime and Punishment, where Raskolnikov asks Sonia to read the section of the St. John's Gospel where the raising of Lazarus. I'm about to cry now. Where who was once dead and came to life. I mean, it's pretty extraordinary, and it kills me just thinking about it.
You mentioned knowing, this is just a question I've had for literary experts. You mentioned knowing Jane Austen well, and lately I've been reading, that Goethe, a genius, we know everything about him in one sense. Shakespeare, we know very little, even the old authorship question and so forth. But I'm thinking of your work, Karen, of the one and the many, that, again, this notion of the muse and the same, Barfieldian paradigm of the muse used to be outside the person. then all of a sudden it gets incarnated. Now the muse is in the innermost sanctum of where the genius says, I am I, and this notion of, do we know Shakespeare? Like, the more universal the literature is, do we know the author less? It should, in my theory, it should be, we know them as an individual and we know all of humanity. Blazing is an individual. Does that map onto anything for people who know much more about literature than I do?
Yeah, well, I did an interview earlier today where somebody asked a question about intention. Like, we're talking about, I think, the Scarlet Letter, and he's like, "Oh, is this what Hawthorne intended?" And I thought, like, that's such a, I didn't say this to the person, but like, that's such a not helpful question. Because because of course a good artist is seeing and intuiting and intending things, but doing that well means they escape his grasp and rational mind and still reflect truth anyway, or more so. And so yeah, I think knowing we don't need to know the author to know the work. I mean, sometimes it's interesting and helpful, but biographical criticism is probably like one of my least favorite forms of criticism for that reason. Although again, we don't want to completely separate. It's helpful to know something about the writer. Like Mary Shelley is an interesting case study there. But that's the transcendence, I guess, of literature and art, and the reversal, maybe, to use your language.
And I'm wondering if, like, according to the level of genius, to use a funny term, we have less interest in the nature of the author. When the genius level goes down a little bit, we probably have more nature because we're probably closer together. But like the genius and the person, it's in this wild harmony. You can't untease the two at the heights of the total geniuses.
I think that's so true. Like, I'm sharing a dissertation right now on William Blake and his and parallels of his vision to Pentecostal theology, just which, like, sort of accidentally. But it's really interesting because Blake is very interesting as a person, but compared to his works and his genius, like
yeah.
Well, that's the thing. And that's my claim, is that if you really want to know the author, read the works, not the biography, right? Because in fact, I was reading. So I'm about to start writing this introduction to Novalis's Christendom or Europe. So I've been reading all this Novalis criticism, and I'm so disappointed because it's the worst thing to read. What Rudolf Steiner said, reading a piece of literary criticism is like touching a corpse.
Sophie died and Hymns to the Night are two totally separate, but they're the same event, right?
Yeah, I mean, so I learned more about reading his actual works about him than I ever could read from any criticism or biography, right? Because those at best are interpretations. But there's something that happens in the primary experience of reading these works, which, and I think in the best cases, it doesn't always, it can open to transcendence. And the weird thing is sometimes you can read the same passage or the same book or the same poem 100 times. Nothing happens.
And there's got to be a way of doing like biographical criticism on an author by people who can also see the poetry in that author's life, right? It's like, putting a body under a microscope after it died to see, like, what was the story of this person's life, son?
Well, I think that's
right. It's left brainism in a right brain area.
Well, that's the take home of Amadeus, right? The film and the play, right? How does the voice of God come through this guy?
Yeah. Well, I think that actually on that one, Michael, kind of like Harry Potter in one way, I almost think the movie Amadeus is a lie because
What is?
It makes Genius. Yeah, it makes Genius look so
I think it's a great movie.
Where his works were watered with his tears, right? And that's kind of Harry Potter, just Quidditch.
And I think it's a beautiful story, and I think it's a beautiful movie. But
I'm glad you're with me.
I don't think
the guy worked really hard.
You don't know Mozart from that movie. You know him from his music.
Yeah, right.
That's how you know, in a way, that's his.
But the movie also lied about what we do know of his biography. Is he worked really, really hard and sweated over these compositions. They make it seem like he was on the shitter and just wrote musical scores on the toilet paper or something. Right? And that's a myth we want to believe. That's a myth we want to believe. Yeah. That's why people love the movie. Makes genius seem super easy.
Mm.
Well, super easy for some. Yeah. It didn't make it super easy for Sally. But anyway, yeah. So and you end the book, Karen, with, is this where it goes with the rapture? Is that where it's right at
Yep.
toward the end, right?
Yep. That's the last chapter.
Yeah.
It's pretty heavy.
Rapture.
Wow. That's like a brick closing.
Well, first, two things. I want you to connect, how does the evangelical imagination deposit in the rapture? And secondly, how does that figure into your own thinking now, after on this long journey you've been?
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, what I'm pointing to in the chapter is, growing up, in being a child of the 70s, and in the midst of all that rapture theology, and the bad novels that were written, and the bad takes, the nonfiction, Hal Lindsey's Late Great Planet
Left
Earth,
Behind.
and Left Behind, all of that. That those sorts of stories and myths and legends do have a formative effect on people when we believe that the Lord's return is near, which of course it is, but if we mean that sort of in temporal, like it's going to be tomorrow's headlines,
But
and
it's always already.
Yeah. And it just, and also just, again, I don't take a side, like how it should be interpreted. There are different schools, but if it's only literal, as opposed to literal, as you just said, is already at and not yet, then we forget we don't even know that there's symbolic and metaphorical resonance for right now. And so it forms a people, it forms a culture, and it forms our imaginations. And of course, it produced a lot of bad art and bad fiction. But regardless, the point that we forget, which I kind of close on, is that if the rapture, even if the rapture is understood literally, again, I don't come down on that. I didn't know it was a novel interpretation invented in the 19th century for a long time. But it also always means that we are to be caught up in Christ, like right now, not just, on the airplane that's going to crash because the pilot's a Christian, but like right now caught up in Christ. And so that's what we have overlooked. That's what our imagination has been, the lack of which has deformed our imagination.
Right. Yeah. And I think, and I tell people, and this is actually, I was into this for a while. I mean, I still am, but I wrote about it kind of extensively a few years ago in a couple of books. But the word parousia doesn't mean second coming. It means presence. Right? So coming into the presence of the Lord.
That's like a now and not yet.
Song? Karen's big on songs because she mentions all kinds of songs in this book. And she starts off, I think the first anecdote is about you with your niece at a concert, right?
Yeah, Mumford and Sons.
Mumford and Sons. Oh, wow. And she has a footnote. It's the best footnote in history about unless you have a cool aunt or something like this, right?
Well, thank you for I tried to make some of my footnotes funny.
That killed me.
You are the first one to comment on the footnotes. So
wow, I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised.
Yeah,
I'm a close reader.
You read the
thing, right?
Thank you. It didn't go wasted.
No, it was great. Thank you for that.
That's funny.
Thank you.
Again, for two literature professors, when you say the rapture, it's now and not yet. So we all get that.
I need more props because it wasn't a footnote; it's an end note. So I had to I had to go.
Yeah, wow, you really.
It wasn't just at the bottom of the page.
That's a publisher style. So yeah.
So if the basic idea, and again, you guys were teaching literature, and we're concerned about the imagination, we're concerned about a restored right brain, and so forth. When you're teaching, when I was even taking theology. If I was taking a course in the apocalypse, which I did, Revelation and John, I think, if they said, the apocalypse is now and not yet, I would have just filed that away. I don't know. I don't know if I would have heard the word, and the notion again that something can be one and many at the same time. When we're teaching imaginative works of literature, which is you guys, that's your job. how do we get to that apperception? How do we get students to that basic thing that this is tolerable, that the whole world, that the wardrobe into Narnia is through this basic apperception of something being one and many at the same time, which is Trinitarian, which is final participation. Because you could teach but isn't that the definition of imagination? Putting yourself into another person's place. That's the training. Put yourself into another person's place. Simone Weil said, don't say, we have this in common. Quiet this, put yourself into another person's place. And again, the notion that something can be, big, small. For me, it's the universe. Can we see ourselves as tiny in the universe and also dominant in the universe if we scale down the other way? That's the imagination. This unified notion that we're tiny in an infinite universe. All the weight is on that side. It's killing the imagination. And this notion of seeing how something can be one in many. Those are kind of three pillars for me. How do we teach that perception? Mike, your work is about raising the levels of perception, but let's get specific on that, right?
Well, I think a great example of that is William Blake's hymn, Jerusalem, right? Because he was looking, he was kind of, in a way, his moment in London, lifelong Londoner, was very similar to our moment right now, because where he grew in the suburbs of London had been overcome by urban sprawl and industrialization, and he saw the churches were literally turning black from the soot. Just like actually where I grew up in Detroit in the 70s and the 80s, the churches were black from pollution. They have since sandblasted them all. But he didn't, he saw that. He didn't say it wasn't there, but he also saw the imaginative reality behind it, where Christ is walking in England's green and pleasant land with Joseph of Arimathea, right? And that was more real to him than the Satanic Mills. And I think that's for me, that's what literature.
So in one sense, your answer is kind of, if we read enough poetry, it calls on that part of our brain. It awakens it. To your answer, like, how do you approach that, Karen?
Yeah, I think that's what I'm trying to start in the book. Like you talked about, if you had heard the phrase, not now and not yet, it might not have even registered, and yet it does register. Just like, you may not realize it, but it gets in there, just like the phrase for my evangelical culture, like left behind. Like that phrase is so resonant, and it says so much, it teaches so much without even teaching it. You don't even have to think about it, and left behind just brings about all kinds of frameworks and categories that
Yeah,
follow. Yeah, so that's a huge, now and not yet versus left behind. It's just a powerful difference. Yeah,
big difference.
Fascinating, right?
And that's the thing. Just the two words for time in Greek, right? Chronos and kairos, right?
Sure.
And in English we confuse them, just like we confuse words for love.
Right.
Again, and I think that's where, when you get into the notion that the worst is the corruption of the best, that lilies that fester smell far worse than weeds, as opposed to evil and good being 180 degrees apart. So it trains the imagination, because you see that tolerance is the mask of forgiveness. You see that optimism is the mask of hope. You see that care is the mask of love. License is the mask of freedom. And whatever's passing for maturity nowadays, we don't even know what that is. But I think that gets to the imagination too. But if you have a religious mindset, a misplaced concrete, we might call it, that evil is 180 degrees away in the opposite direction than good, you're just not going to develop the imagination.
Yeah. Well, we should probably wrap it up there. And I just want to tell everybody, go get Karen's books, and especially this one. Look, check it out. She signed this one to me. Inscribed. Look at that. It's beautiful. Now, the funny thing is, I didn't tell Karen this. Now, what's your husband's name? Roy, because when it came to me, it had his name on the return. I'm like, what the hell is this? Roy Pryor. I don't know Roy Pryor. Who sent me a book? I didn't order a book.
I use those free return address labels you get. He gets them from the NRA all the time, I think. So
that's good.
Karen Swallow Pryor, keeping it real.
Blue collar Roy. But Karen, thank you so much. This is I wish.
Thank you.
The only thing that can make this better is if I could walk up to you and hug you.
Aww.
It would be the best thing. But thank you so much. I've been looking forward to this for more than a decade.
Well, it was a delight, and may the Lord bring us together in person sometime.
I would
So
love that. And I would
Amen.
love nothing
Amen.
more. Okay.
Well,
Thank
then,
you for-
thank you everyone for listening to the Regeneration Podcast. You can find us on YouTube, or you can check your Spotify, The Regeneration Podcast, and see you all next week.